So this Industrious Revolution, right, okay, or at least what our friend De Vries calls it, starts off in the Netherlands, right, the Dutch Republic, right, and then spreads to England and other major cities in Western Europe, right, okay. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. It's a lot of what you might not regard them as luxuries, right? Tea, coffee, sugar, right? I hope you don't smoke, but tobacco, right? Okay, we take as very mainstream today, right? Maybe tobacco less so. But at that time, these were obviously innovations in people's consumption. And you had, it's only going to take place because you've got an extensive trading network, right, with long-distance shipping, bringing in the produce of the colonies, of the tropical and semi-tropical colonies, right? Now, I don't think Virginia is exactly a semi-tropical colony, but Virginia has a rather warmer climate than Britain, so it's able to grow tobacco, right? Now, you can grow tobacco in Britain, but you get the flowers, right? I remember as a kid planting tobacco seeds and getting tobacco flowers, but you certainly don't produce tobacco, right? And we had tobacco from Virginia, and by the early 18th century, even poor people would have their little bit of tobacco, right, in their pipe, right? Cigarettes don't come into much later, right, in the pipe. And the British, right, were the first to put sugar in tea and coffee. First people in the world, consumer innovation for you, right, to put sugar in coffee, right, and tea. Now, tea doesn't grow in Britain, coffee doesn't grow in Britain, right? And sugar, you can get sugar from sugar beet, but cheap sugar cane, obviously, we've got that in Britain, right? So we have sugar cane and coffee from the West Indies, and we have tea from India and China, right? Okay? And these become everyday articles of commerce. Right? Another thing is increasing cotton goods, cotton rather than wool or hemp, right, or linen. Right, and back to our smelly, dirty Europeans not taking baths, right? In the old days, you'd be, seriously, I'm not kidding, you'd be sewn up in your woolen garment for the winter, right? And Lord knows what you smelt like when you emerged in the spring, right? Okay, I mean, people wore clothes till they literally disintegrated, right? And it was remarked by, there's a whole fund of interesting observations by continental observers, right, to England, right? And they observe how ordinary people, right, are wearing, this is England, not Scotland and Ireland so much, right? But England are wearing cotton, how the women will wear cotton dresses, right? And the men will wear cotton shirts. And they're colourful, right? Cheap dyes, right? Indigo particularly. You see, cotton from the southern states doesn't become an export to England until the 1790s, right? Prior to that, you're getting indigo and tobacco, right, from the American colonies, of course, slave plantations. Now, so England certainly has a higher material standard of living and higher real wages, meaning the purchasing power of wages, right, than anywhere else in Europe. Now, part of the reason why it's not because of astounding increases in productivity, right? Okay, that doesn't come yet. But it's because of the Industrious Revolution. And the Industrious Revolution is increasing participation in the marketplace. Men work longer hours, and women start working for the market rather than at home, right? And they might be working for other people, which is one possibility, and the other thing is making items at home which they sell on the market, right? So increasing participation by women and older children actually in the market. And that carries on all the way through, slows down, until 1850. And in 1850, I'm going ahead, I know, but in 1850, the real wages of working men in industrial Britain were high enough they could support the whole family without the women and children going out to work, right? So the women then stay home and make the homes much nicer than they were before. Then, taking the story further, I know I'm jumping way ahead, to my lifetime, right, 1950, I was born in 48, which seems ages to you guys, I know, but 1950, about 1950, you see rising women participation in work, right? So you had a long trend in which women are less participating in the marketplace, right? And then in 1950, you start getting the upward trend of women participating in the workforce, right? You see, it was common, and not that a lot of women didn't participate in the workforce, but when they got married, they ceased to participate, right, in market activities. Okay? That's what happened. And that got reversed from 1950 onwards. Okay? So now the final story is the participation rate for women, labour force participation rate for women, right? That is the proportion of people of working age, women of working age, men of working age, right? The participation rate for women is not much shorter than the participation rate for men, right? And that is 63 years later than 1950, right? 2013. All right, okay, but back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. All right, okay, so well, just to finish off the points on the first sheet, all right, okay? We do this very quickly, and it's all there anyway. The highest material standard of living was probably among Europeans, or European descended, in the 13 colonies. Right? Probably higher on average than English in England, right? Okay? And that reflected the availability of natural resources and the shortage of labour, and wage rates were high, right? Okay, so if you were a free labourer, right, okay, which would almost certainly be European, although there was some free black labour, free European labour, right, in the colonies, you probably knew were skilled, right, or even unskilled actually. The unskilled rates were relatively higher than the skilled, right, okay, sorry, you got more as a skilled workman than as unskilled, right. But in Europe, there was an abundance of skilled workmen, of unskilled labour. So wage rates were low, right? And in America, there was a shortage of labour. So even unskilled workers could earn more. In fact, unskilled and skilled both probably earn more than their European equivalents in London. London was as highly paid as anywhere, right? Okay. But the skilled rate was probably comparable, but the unskilled rate in the American colonies was higher, right? Because such a shortage of labour. So if you were able-bodied, right, perhaps without skills, if you can get yourself across the Atlantic, you'd have a better future, right? That's the 13 colonies on the eve of independence, right? Of course, black slave labour, of course, is a different story. I'm happy to answer questions about that, which are not really relevant to what we're doing here, but happy to talk about whole economics of slavery in the question time, perhaps, or during the day. All right, okay. Population growth in Europe accelerated in the 18th century prior to the Industrial Revolution, right? That's important. And during that time, because we haven't yet got an industrial revolution, real wage rates either stabilized or fell, right? Life expectancy fell because of more urbanization, and people became shorter. How do we know people became shorter? Because we do have the height of recruits into the army, right, and the navy, right, for every year for many major European powers. So we can see they're actually declining the height of people, right? Which does suggest, okay, now, this always permits two explanations, right? Okay, and it could be because they're poorer, their diet is not as good, right? And they're shorter, right? Okay, that's not a nice story. Or it could be, and De Vries suggests this, it could be because people are working longer through the Industrious Revolution, and therefore this has a physical impact on them, right? So there's always two explanations for everything. Or more than two. Right. All right. Okay. Now, Britain is increasingly urbanized, increasingly commercial, increasing amount of manufacturing, not industrial revolution yet, but manufacturing, so that Britain becomes the first country that is a net importer of grain. And that's probably true. I've seen some people say they're not 1730s. I've seen other people say the 1740s, right? I mean, I haven't researched to the point of being able to say to you which is right, but probably by 1750, there's no doubt about it, Britain was a net importer of grain. And where do they get their grain from? They got it from Germany and Poland, places like that, right? Now the irony, if you want to call it irony, the irony is that in the late 19th century, Germany becomes a net importer of grain as Germany industrializes too. Right? And both Britain and Germany got their grain from North America, which probably won't surprise you. Okay, I want to leave you with a question. I don't want to resolve it. People talk about European exceptionalism, right? Okay. Now, I have no doubt, neither does Goody deny, that Europe was the cutting edge from about 1600 through to about 1950. Right? And we're going to include the European offshoot in America. Right? We're going to include that. Right? Okay. But in terms of the big picture, it's a rather different story. Right? It's a rather different story. And we shouldn't mistake the fact the European cutting edge in 1700, 1800, 1900, right, for some permanent long-term effect. What causes that? Well, you get different explanations. Some people go back to Greco-Roman civilization. Some people talk about the impact of the Catholic Church. Some people talk about the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, right? Some people like to talk about European hegemony in the world and the empires, right? Okay. I don't think any of them really, I mean, the thing is this, they can all contribute. What you find is this, in a lot of these books, right, somebody's got an idea which is plausible, right, okay, and they make it, I was talking to a colleague, actually, my colleague, my office mate, my colleague, and he said, he was talking about this in a somewhat different context, how people want to sell books, okay, which is understandable. So they have an insight that other people don't have, or maybe they do, actually probably there is an insight out there, but they develop it and it's their forte, and they promote it to the exclusion of everything else. After all, I mean, perhaps fair and understandable, right? You know, you've got your idea that people are downplaying the role of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Catholic Church, Greco-Roman civilization, whatever, right? And then the whole story then rotates around this, right? Okay, and you've got to be very wary of that, because other people can spin equally attractive stories about their thing that does it. There's a series of books, more than one, on how the Scots made the modern world. The Scots. I think the Scottish achievement in the Enlightenment with Smith and Hume was amazing, right? As an intellectual enlightenment, but I don't think the Scots made the modern world. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But the Scots made a big achievement, and maybe people haven't recognised enough of it, right? You know. But he had a book called How the Scots Made the Modern World. Okay, but it's ridiculous. You can equally well write how the Germans made the modern world, how the English made the modern world, right? And so on and so forth, right? So you will be very careful of a lot of these books, actually. That they have a theme, they may be an interesting contribution, they may find new stuff we don't know, but they put everything, they have so much turning on it. Because it makes a sexy story, right? It sells books, right? And in fact, life is so much more a history. The historical record is so much more complicated than that. All right, okay. So we now move on, finally, to the second sheet of paper, right? Okay. The title of this book is this lecture is a nod to Landy's The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change in the Industrial Development in Western Europe from 1750 to the present day. And that came out in 1969. He called it Unbound Prometheus. So I've talked about Promethean Growth Unleashed, right? I could have said unbound, but unleashed. Anyway. All right. Now, Landy's, by the way, somebody said they'd read Landy's. Remind me of the book by Landy's that you'd read, the title, because it's quite well known.
The Wealth and Poverty of Nations.
That's right. It was a much later book by Landy's, okay? In my opinion, I think Jones's book is a better book, actually, for example. And both of them stress the European miracle angle, right? I'm not saying it's not a good book, right? Okay, there's a lot of good books, right? Okay? Actually, I think Landy's best book is a book on the history of time, clocks and watches. It's a very early book, right? Okay. Often people write the most interesting stuff as come out of a PhD thesis or something, right? And they write a book. It's new, original stuff. And then later on, of course, they write more and more stuff, which actually then sells better book, sells more. Although the book on clocks and watches, actually, one on time, called Time, sold actually quite well. But the Landy's is better known among younger people for the book that our friend has just told us, right? Okay, I want to get the title right. The Wealth and Poverty. What is it? Sorry, what is it again? Sorry. The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, which of course is a play on Adam Smith's full title, The Wealth of Nations, which is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It's a play on that. Right. Okay. The problem with Landy's, and actually Goody critiques him on this, is that it's too Eurocentric. Right. It makes a lot of assumptions about Europe and seems to be ignorant of what's going on in the rest of the world. Okay. But certainly something amazing did happen in Europe in the period of the 19th century. And that's what I want to talk about. Okay, right. Now, this talk is entitled The Industrial Revolution. Now, it struck me as I put my notes together and thought about this, that there is actually different meanings of the term Industrial Revolution, right? So I hope this doesn't sound too much like a sort of graduate school seminar, but there are different meanings. There is the narrowest definition, which is the idea of a sort of technological change embodied in capital, right? Quintessentially characterized by the application of steam engines, right, to mass production of cotton textiles in large factories in Lancashire in England, in northwest England. That's sort of quintessentially the Industrial Revolution, right? Reflecting, as Robert C. Allen, a recent historian, has pointed out, reflects the relatively high price of labour and the relatively low price of coal. Now, this is very much an economist perspective, which I think doesn't really do full service to, you know, the Industrial Revolution. Okay, but he's looking, as an economist, he's looking at relative prices. What you've got is this. You've got a technology of steam engines, right, which takes about 100 years to develop. And, okay? So ancient Greeks knew that you could boil water and you get steam, right? And it dissipates, right? It was a question of making a machine that got the steam to power wheels, right, that moved apparatus, right? Okay, that takes 100 years to develop properly, right? And there's a very interesting story there. So by about 1700, you got Newcomen very soon after that with a steam engine, but it's a very inefficient steam engine. By 1800, we got much more advanced, much more efficient steam engines. When I say efficient steam engines, I mean we don't lose a lot of steam out there in the atmosphere. We get the steam to drive the machines, right? But the curious thing is this, that the early Industrial Revolution in Britain, in the late 18th, early 19th century, it was mainly powered by water power and not by steam engines. Right? And I wasn't really aware of that until recently, actually. Then I thought of the steam engine, right? And you hear all about the steam engine. But early on, right, it was water power. Okay, it was water power. And in New England, this I always knew, it was when the Industrial Revolution leapt to America and we had mass production of textiles in New England, it was water power initially. It wasn't steam engines, right? Now, the argument by Allen would be this, that labour is relatively expensive, right? I told you that real wages, even though they stagnated, are higher in London, right, than they are elsewhere in Europe. And coal is relatively cheap. Right? And after all, there's no big forests. They've all been cut down. Right? So we can't really use forests to burn wood, right, for heating purposes, which you could do in some parts of Europe, still huge forests at that time. Right? Okay. So Britain has a relatively low price of coal. Right? It has the technology of the steam engine, and this is relatively cheap compared with paying people to do labouring work. Right? So that's Allen's explanation for the Industrial Revolution, at least in terms of the introduction of steam engines, right? Okay. But, you know, that isn't surely all what we mean by the Industrial Revolution. It's not just the application of steam engines to the production of cotton textiles in large factories in northwestern Europe, in northwestern England. Amazing and impressive as that may be, even if not quite as impressive as Gothic cathedrals. All right. Okay, well, it depends on how you're impressed. Okay, so there's surely a broader definition, and I've come up with a broader definition and a broadest definition. The broader definition is a supply-side revolution that occurs in Britain, England, Wales, Scotland, Ulster, that's the northeastern corner of Ireland. Later on, Belgium and northeastern France. Why Belgium and northeastern France? Because they're sitting on top of a coal field. So you can therefore mine the coal to burn the coal to power the steam engines, right? You know the story, right? Okay. And later, some parts of Germany, sitting on coal fields. Switzerland, which isn't sitting on coal fields, but it's got falling water, right, for water power. New England, water power, and elsewhere in the US and later in Japan. Japan is the first country in Asia to industrialize, right? Late 19th century. All right, so I want to, so this is something broader, right? Okay. Again, it's an emphasis on supply side, technology embodied in capital. And that's one thing I want to emphasize, because you get a lot of economists who talk about, oh, we need labor and land and capital and technology. But as if they're all four separate things, right? And we put them together, like mixing them up, calling different formulas. No, technology is always embodied in capital, right? You can't imagine technology not being embodied in capital. So it's always capital accumulation embodying new technology, right? And sometimes, actually, the accumulation of capital embodying an old technology, right? Okay, because technology can flow fast. But if you haven't got the capital, you can't, if you like, metaphor, can't put the technology to work. Okay, the next thing to say is there is a decidedly regional character, right, in the Industrial Revolution. It isn't like the whole of Britain industrializes. It's various parts. In fact, some parts started industrializing and then fell back, right? Okay. And it's partly dictated by the availability of coal mines, right? Okay. Okay, and that is in the 19th and early 20th century, with transport costs falling dramatically, right, between the periphery and the core. And the core is northwestern Europe or Western Europe and the United States, the eastern United States, and the periphery is the rest of the world, right? Okay, and communications is much, much cheaper. Transport is much, much cheaper because of the advances in maritime science. Okay, and later on, of course, the railroads, which start to make inland transport much cheaper. Prior to that, the cheapest form of inland transport was navigable canals, and you had a very extensive system of navigable canals in America, and for that matter in Britain, right? But some parts of the world, obviously, you don't have navigable canals, and it was really the railroads that did it. By the way, just as a not totally irrelevant afterthought, well, not afterthought, parenthetical point, you hear, standard high school history tells you the railroads made America, right? Okay. In fact, because there was a really extensive system of navigable canals, the contribution of the railroads, significant as it was actually not as significant as they might have you believe, because the contribution of the railroads is not the value of the railroads, it's the incremental value of the railroads over the navigable canals, right? So that's an important point, actually. That's an important point. The railroads didn't make as much contribution to America as some people think, because you already had navigable canals. Okay, so, all right. Now, the broadest definition is one that encompasses, one that embraces, right, okay, not just technological developments in industry and manufacturing, but rather defined as, and I underline this, sustained economic growth per person. It begins in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century and continues to this day throughout the world. And it embodies change and progress, I should say progress, in agriculture and commerce as well as industry, and more recently embracing China, India, and much of the rest of the world. That is known as Promethean growth. After all, Landis coined the phrase, the Unbound Prometheus, right? And Prometheus, as you may know, right, was the bringer of fire, was the god of the Greek mythology, bringer of fire. And clearly fire is a pretty important thing, right? So this is a Promethean growth, okay? Now, Britain certainly was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in both the first sense and the third sense, right? Okay. But, okay, the interesting thing is this, that the estimates for economic growth, right, which were accepted 50 years ago, have all been revised down for the period 1760 to 1830, right? So what we've got is this. The story I learned as a schoolboy and an undergraduate is, here we are, very, very slow rate of growth, economic growth. Britain has an industrial revolution, right, and there we are. I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating. Right? But the new estimates come in, oh, we don't have a red pen, too bad. Anyway, the new estimates for the Industrial Revolution come in at a lower rate of growth, right? You with me? So it's going to be a less steep growth, which suggests that there's more economic output in 1760 than they thought. So the story of the Industrious Revolution fits in quite nicely here, right? Okay? People are participating more in the market, they're working longer hours, they're producing more stuff to the market. That gives us economic growth. It gives them less leisure, but it also gives them more economic growth. And then we do have, that looks as if it's, actually I don't mean to say that, sorry, I don't want to suggest there isn't some increase. Right, okay, but there we are. So then it starts getting larger, right? Okay, a faster rate of economic growth. But the really rapid increases in economic growth don't really come until the 1830s onwards. Oh, whoops, that's bad. Exactly opposite of what I'm trying to do. There we are. Right, don't really come until the 1830s, 1840s, and for the rest of the 19th century. All right? Okay, that's the reality, and it's generally accepted that that is the case now. All right, so a lot of the talk by people who are not economic historians will give you numbers which were accepted 50 years ago and are now generally not accepted, right? Okay, but that doesn't mean something dramatic didn't happen. Why have they overestimated, or why did they overestimate it? Well, part of it was this: they were spectacular increases in the output of textiles, right, where the Industrial Revolution first took place, mass. Factories with hundreds and hundreds of people managing machines, right? Enormous increases in productivity. So there was that. But the point was it was a very small part of the economy, right? And what they'd done was they'd exaggerated the importance of that in the total economy. And so what that did was give you growth rates we clearly didn't, the whole economy didn't achieve, right? So, but of course by 1830 it's now a much bigger part of the economy, right? Right? All right, so that's that. There's that point. As a result, some economists started saying, "Oh, there isn't an industrial revolution; it's an industrial transition." But nobody's going to say that now, right? I mean, that was in play for about 10 years, and I noticed actually a new book that I actually use for other reasons in my class does sort of rather still play around with that, but. The idea it's better called an industrial transition than an industrial revolution. But on the other hand, there's plenty of people who say it was dramatic enough to merit the term revolution. And I'm happy to stick to the industrial revolution, which is why I suggested that I speak on the industrial revolution and not on the industrial transition. Right? Okay. So we'll stick to industrial revolution. Right? Okay. All right. Now, the phrase industrial revolution, this might interest you. In English, the first time it rises is in lectures on the Industrial Revolution published posthumously by Arnold Toynbee in 1884. He was a lecturer at the University of Oxford, right? Okay. He's a relation of, you may have come across Toynbee's history, multi-volume history, right? He's part of the Toynbee family. And there's a lefty writer who's atrocious, The Guardian, right, twice a week. She's also a Toynbee family. Right? I knew her when she was a student. She's got this high-paid job in The Guardian. She's really dreadful. I mean, it was almost like every day, she writes twice or three times a week. Every column embodies the worst social thinking on problems. She's an awful woman. All right, awful. I mean, usually these people have a good day and they write some decent stuff. But it seems like, she never, awful woman. Anyway, she's part of the Toynbee family as well, right? All right, okay. But there's a guy called Arnold Toynbee, okay, who actually died by the time his book comes in. Right, okay, so he dies young. But he was a lecturer, and it's called Lectures on the Industrial Revolution. That's the first use in English. Now, it turns out that in Révolution industrielle was being used widely in France in the early 19th century. And the German equivalent, which I won't even try to talk about, right, was also being used, right? But it's interesting that the home of the Industrial Revolution didn't use the phrase until 1884. And Toynbee talks about it in terms of a sort of rather narrower supply-side idea. And certainly when I was a school child in England, the Industrial Revolution was all about machines and factories and steam engines and things like that, right? But To me, I'm much more interested in the broader idea of the transformation of the economy, right? Okay, that transcends just, you know, steam engines and factories. All right, okay, well, I see I repeated the point about Britain, a net importer of grain. Okay, just to deal quickly with a few things that come up. You may hear people who say this, that the Enclosure Acts were important in promoting the Industrial Revolution, because let me just remind you what the Enclosure Acts were, or tell you what the Enclosure Acts were. The Enclosure Acts were the enclosure of common land in England by Parliamentary Act, private Parliamentary Act. So if I'm a local landowner and it's sort of common land, right, where everybody's grazing their, you know, cows and pigs, right, and I want to turn it into maybe grain growing, and, you know, then I go to Parliament, right, and I get them to pass a private act that encloses that land. Now that went on from the Tudors onwards in the 16th century. So by the time the Industrial Revolution rolls around, there's been a lot of Enclosure Acts, and there haven't been an Industrial Revolution, right? But the argument is that the Enclosure Acts drove some of the peasantry off the land and made them a cheap supply of labour for the factories, right? Go to the factories. Now, well, this, as you might imagine, sort of fits in quite nicely with a Marxist perspective on the world, right? Okay, which is the idea of the poor, hapless workers at the bow of economic forces that they can't control, right? Okay. Now, I'm not defending the Enclosure Acts, right? Okay. I'm not defending the Enclosure Acts, okay? Because although there were customary acts, there were customary rights to land that were taken away by the Enclosure Acts, right? But if you want to say, well, you know, if it hadn't been for the supply of cheap labour from the land, right, through the Enclosure Acts, that's why we got the Industrial Revolution, then I'm less than convinced, right? Okay, the Enclosure Acts do carry on all the way through until 1840, 1850, right? But most of the enclosures have already taken place prior to the Industrial Revolution. And again, we can look at De Vries, right, who says that it isn't just a question of people being pushed off land. It's a question of people wanting to go to the cities, because life in the country had its limitations. After all, it was Karl Marx who wrote about the idiocy of rural life. Right? Karl Marx was very much in favour of the Industrial Revolution, of course, and capitalism, right? Contrary to what you might think. He saw it as a necessary stage before we achieve the socialist communist paradise. Right? Right? But he was quite enthusiastic about it as a necessary stage to get there. Okay? So, and he was well aware of the limitations of living in the countryside. Right? Okay? You can imagine, right? Bright, young, interested people like yourselves, right? Getting a little bit limited by the lifetime in the village and wanting to go into the city, even if you knew that the death rate in the city was higher. Because the reason why the cities expanded in the Middle Ages and the early modern era through the Industrial Revolution was not because their births exceeded their deaths and it was just a natural rate of increase. It was because the death rate in the cities has always been high, not now of course, but the death rate in the cities has always been higher than the death rate in the countryside. But it's because of people flooding in from the countryside. That's why cities grew in the Middle Ages. That's why cities grew in the early modern era. Okay. Now, the next thing, and I've already alluded to this, is, was the British Empire important in financing the Industrial Revolution? And there was a theory back in the 40s by a Marxist scholar, became very popular, which is that it was the wealth from the slave plantations in the West Indies that financed the Industrial Revolution. All right? Okay. This is now almost entirely rejected by economic historians, right? Even Marxist economic historians. Okay. And you know, it raises an interesting question, which is a broader question, is does empire contribute to prosperity? And as I'm sure Anthony has told you, and as Anthony will tell you if you ask him, empire is a drain on prosperity rather than a source of prosperity, right? After all, Spain, some people in Spain, the elites, prospered through the Spanish Empire. No one's denying that. But did Spain become a modern progressive society as a result of the acquisition of the American colonies? The answer is no. Neither did Portugal. Neither did the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Neither did the Chinese Empire. Neither did a lot of other empires either. All right. And there's been work done on the British, extensive British Empire, right? Particularly in India, right? In the late 19th century. Did this contribute towards British prosperity? No. It made some people better off. People who got nice, cozy jobs in India for a while, okay. But was it a net gain to the British economy? No, it wasn't. There were people in northwestern England in the cotton textile factories who exported textiles to England, to India, right? And they probably, did okay out of it. But what about the rest of us who are not employed in the cotton textile industry, right? So generally speaking, the British Empire was a drain. And in fact, many commentators at the time said so, including the great Richard Cobden. All right, next one. What about, maintaining that empire and fighting all these wars, which the British were very good at doing, as Anthony has told you, right, was a great drain on the British state, on the British taxpayer, right? Okay, now there's two ways in which it drained the wealth of the country. Number one, it was always borrowing to finance those wars. And there's a brand new book, which I didn't even know about last week, by Temin and Voth called Prometheus Shackled. Notice how this word Prometheus keeps cropping up. But he's shackled this time. He's not unleashed and unbound. He's shackled, right? Okay. Goldsmith, Banks, and England's Financial Revolution after 1700, which apparently contains some interesting stuff on the evolution of banking in Britain, but that's not what I'm talking about now. I'm talking about the fact that funds were diverted to financing the British wars rather than financing economic development, and then eventually the Industrial Revolution. Right? Okay, that's number one. It's a brand new book, and it'll be interesting to see what people have to say about it, right? Because there are other authors, one whose book I've used in the past, which is very good in many, many ways, who claims that actually the Industrial Revolution didn't require that much finance initially, and that in fact fighting the wars wasn't really a drain on it, right? But anyway, he argues it was a drain on the economic development. Now, something which is uncontroversial now is that taxation in Britain became increasingly regressive. In other words, increasingly was from poor people or lower income people. And it was regressive taxation because it taxed their articles of consumption, like beer, tea, coffee, right, tobacco, right, all these items, and a variety of other things. And this was a big burden on ordinary people. And as a result, just at a time when productivity is increasing in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, ordinary people were no better off. In fact, they were worse off. Why? Because they're now paying more taxes. Okay, that's what that's about. From the 1820s, that's to finance those French wars. First of all, the French Revolutionary Wars and then the Napoleonic Wars. You see, it wasn't just the Royal Navy, which was the biggest navy in the world, right? But it was also that the British poured money into other countries fighting land armies against Napoleon, right? They lent money to Russia, Austria, Prussia, right, to fight. And they also sent troops, but they didn't do most of the fighting in Europe, but they financed it to a large extent, right? All this is very, very costly. They accumulate a lot of debt, right, okay, which is a drain on funds for industrialization, and it also is paid for by taxation, which is very regressive, right? It isn't until the 1820s that rising material living standards starts to be quite noticeable, starts really to be taking place in Britain, and that continues all through the 19th century. And from the 1870s onwards, we have better nutrition that makes people more resistant to disease, and an understanding of how infectious diseases are spread, right? Okay, because if you don't understand how they're spread, the best of intentions, and isn't going to help you, right? You've got to understand how they're spread. You see, the theory about disease was that sort of like proximity, right? So if you're next to a pile of rotting animal matter, then the idea is, well, you're more likely to get the disease. I mean, you might say, well, that sort of gets at it, but they don't really understand how disease is transmitted. There was work done in around 1850 which understood that actually it was they could put down an outbreak of cholera in London to particular water faucet, right? What the Brits call a tap. A tap in a public square, they put it down to that. And they realised immediately what it was, and from then onwards, dealing with infectious diseases really starts getting underway. And from the 1870s, we have falling infant mortality rates. But in the early years, I mean, 20th century, medicine doesn't really get going, apart from the containment of a few infectious diseases, until really the 20th century. And the main reason why people are more resistant to disease is because they've got better diets. And the Industrial Revolution, in the broad sense, is bringing that about through communications. You can have cows, you did. Every evening, the cows would be milked in Southern Ireland. The milk would be put onto milk trains, which would then go to the port, right, Rosslea, across the Irish Sea to Swansea in Wales, and then put on trains to London. So in London, you're drinking the milk from the cows in County Kerry in the previous evening, right? It's the transport revolution that brings around the movement of fresh food. The reason why there is no example of a modern advanced economy with a famine, right? I'm being very careful when I'm saying this, right? Is because there's no case in history. Right, I mean, that history is like 200 years. There's no case of famine is because of better transportation, of moving food from areas where there's a surplus to areas where there's a shortage. And it's markets that facilitate that. The opportunity to make profit by buying in one area and selling in another. Now, if you bring up to me the Irish famine takes place in Southern Ireland, dependent on, it's an agricultural subsistence community. It is not an industrial society, and it's dependent entirely on almost entirely their diet turns on potatoes, right? Okay. It's not an industrial society. There is no industrial society. There's other major famines, right? There's famines in Ukraine under Stalin. There's famines in Bengal in India in the 1890s and also in the 1940s. Thank you, Winston Churchill. But you're supposed to, yeah, exactly. I was waiting for that. Waiting for a laugh from Anthony. Anyway, but those are all famines which are engineered by governments, right, in the first place, or caused by government dereliction, right? They're not the functions of industrial societies, right? They're not something that happens naturally in industrial society. Okay, almost finished. All right, okay. So, the thing about the Industrial Revolution is it all, in a narrow sense, right, in terms of steam engines and big factories with hundreds of people running around tending the machinery, right, that is something that really takes quite a while. It's characterized by the cotton textile industry, but things like metalworking in craft industries, right, metalworking and things like that remain craft industries until the 1850s, right? So the Industrial Revolution takes quite a while to be sort of in terms of standard industrial manufacturing large scale. So by the mid-19th century, which by the way, Britain is the first country for the first time to have a majority of people living in towns in the 1851 census. So by the mid-19th century, you do get the production of mass production of a lot of manufacturers, right? Not just cotton textiles, not just textiles, right? But it does take quite a while. Now, because I like this definition of the Industrial Revolution as sustained economic growth, right, or the reason why I like that, is because clearly we don't want to forget about highly productive agriculture, right? Okay. And just as England took over from the Netherlands as the most productive, agriculturally productive country, right, in the 18th century, so Denmark becomes the agriculturally most productive country in the late 19th century. Now, Denmark does actually have some industry and manufacturing, if only Lego, right? But there are other things as well. But it is certainly part of the Industrial Revolution, right? Because it's feeding all those people in towns who don't feed themselves. And it's feeding them at a remarkably high level of productivity, agricultural productivity. And when I was a kid, You buy your cheese, your eggs, your butter, your ham, right, all from Denmark, just shipping across the North Sea, right. Denmark was like the sort of garden of England in an important sense, or the farm of England. Still is to some extent. Okay. But increasingly, falling transport costs brought in goods from all over the world. They got the idea of refrigeration of meat. Okay, look, refrigeration comes in the 1840s and 50s. Canning, by the way, cans, comes in during the Napoleonic War, right? Okay, it's as early as that. Refrigeration comes in the 1840s, 50s. I think America had the first refrigerated rail cars in like the 1850s. You check it out, go to Wikipedia, it's very good for that sort of thing. By the 1880s, they had refrigerated ships from Australia bringing meat, frozen meat, to the British market. Right? Okay. And some parts of the temperate parts of the world, southern cone of South America, particularly Argentina and Uruguay, because they face on the Atlantic and the shipping costs are lower, much lower than from Chile. Right? Okay. Australia and New Zealand and North America, of course, they're all shipping goods, commodities, agricultural commodities to Europe. And that is part of the Industrial Revolution in a broad sense. In the late 19th century, industrialization in Sweden and elsewhere in Europe, right? From the 1890s, industrialization in northern Italy, Spain around Barcelona, Greece, the Piraeus, where there's a lot of harbors and shipbuilding, and Russia around St. Petersburg and Moscow. Most of Russia was not industrializing, but Moscow and Petersburg. That's why the Bolsheviks got a foothold in 1917 in Moscow, right? Because there were some industrial workers to whom they could make an appeal. But it certainly wasn't where Marx thought the first socialist or communist societies would be established. He thought they would be established in England and Germany, the most economically advanced countries. He would have been amazed at the idea. And in fact, I'm sure Lenin would have preferred to have get his revolution going in London, right? And not Moscow and St. Petersburg, but he had to make do. Okay. Which is why, of course, the revolution took the course it did, because it was very largely a rural country. Japan becomes the first Asian country to embark upon industrialization, and of course Japanese colonies, including South Korea from 1905. All right. By 1890, total US industrial output has overtaken that of the UK. It's not something to be sad about, it's something to be glad about. It's a reflection on the industrialization and the economic expansion and growth of the United States. By 1900, the German industrial output has overtaken that of the UK. Output per head in the US surpassed that of the UK, okay, eventually, right? But the UK had the highest standard of living in Europe in 1914. And this remains true until the 1960s, actually. Now, one thing the British did, okay, this is the last 2 minutes, right? What happens to the course of Britain, given that it was the first industrial nation? Well, one thing is British investment overseas, and I don't just mean in the empire. There was massive British investment in the Americas, both in North America and also in South America, right? Massive British investment. And what this did was bring in a lot of income for the Brits from their investment. So therefore you find that the measures of GDP and GNP start to diverge. And the difference is, this is pretty technical, you might know this if you've done economics, but GDP plus net income from abroad equals GNP, right? So if the Brits got a lot of net income from abroad, then their GNP rises over their GDP. And that's what actually happened. What about British technology? You then get the idea like 30, 40, 50 years ago, there's a gradual decline in in the relative, advance of British technology in the late 19th century. It's now generally, generally accepted, but it is now widely accepted, partly because of the work of David Edgerton, who's a historian of science and technology in London, that actually British technology, the Germans get very good at dyestuffs, right, and chemicals, right? Okay, so, you'd expect this. Each country specializes. But in many ways, Britain is up there with America until the 1960s in leading engineering and technological research. After all, it was the British who invented radar. Right? The British contributed towards the nuclear bomb. Right? A whole lot of things, actually. So actually the British didn't decline. I mean, you've got to distinguish, it's a very important point between, and this is important today. Everybody tells you, oh, America, like, you know, is producing less and less. Well, they're not producing less and less. They're producing relatively less and less because other countries are producing more, right? I mean, and also a lot of errors. And people say America manufacturing has gone downhill. The value added by American manufacturing is higher today than it was 30 years ago. They just employ far fewer people. That, ladies and gentlemen, is progress, right? Okay. Final question. Well, I'm over time. Will economic growth slacken? You hear a lot of people saying, well, number one, resource constraints, right? Well, resource constraints are subject, of course, to human ingenuity. I'll leave that to another lecture by another person or afterwards. The other thing you get is the idea that we're slowing down in technological progress. I will leave you with one thought on that, and that is that we don't know what will happen tomorrow. If we did, we would be there already. Okay? We don't know. You get a lot of people saying, I will take your question, I promise. You take a lot of people who say that, you know, there's going to be a slowdown in technological progress, right? But the whole nature of technological discovery is you don't know it till you're there, right? You don't know till you're there. Okay? It's one thing to project the number of people who are going to be retired in 2030 claiming Social Security. Okay, we have a pretty good idea of what that will be. Although we don't always know the rate of medical advance and things, but to say what will be, you know, the technology, what we will discover in 2025, which will bring about new consumer goods in 2030, no one knows. No one can know, because if we knew, we'd have those goods today. Your question, sir.
So you talk about how railroads and steam trains and stuff weren't quite as important as canals, but...
I didn't say that. No. What I said was this. No, I didn't say that. Be careful. Sorry, pick on you. But I didn't say that. What I said was they weren't... Look, for the United States, actually I was very careful what I said. For the United States, the contribution of railroads were not as great as conventionally believed by high school history textbooks, right? And high school history teachers. Because they underestimate you see, the measure of the contribution of the railroads is the marginal contribution over what the canals were providing, right? Now, where there are no canals, like in most of the developing world, railroads are very, very important, right? Railroads are very, very important. They're very, very important for bringing things like rubber and raw materials to the ports for export. And now, increasingly, of course, manufacturers. Okay, back to you, but I did want to make that clarification.
I mean, like, a majority of America is inland, and I mean, yes, there's a bunch of coast, but there's still a lot of area that doesn't have direct access to either. I
agree, and I'm not suggesting that the economic development of America post-1870 wasn't helped by the American railroads in a significant way. But at the time they brought the railroads in, which was as early as the 1830s and 1840s, right, we had an extensive navigable canal system, right, in northeastern America where there was the concentration of population, right? I mean, yes, I'm not suggesting we could have working canals in Colorado, although I'm not really an authority on it. Maybe you could, right? And I realize it's the railroads that made Colorado, but that's not what I was saying. You've got to put it in the historical context, right? Which is the introduction. And I might also say, one last thing, is that the construction of the transcontinental railroads was very heavily subsidized, and in a free market would not have occurred quite when it did, right? And even though it's wonderful to wave our flags and we've now connected America, right, okay, and all that sort of baloney, right, the fact of the matter is it was a waste of resources to build transcontinental railroads in the early 1860s. Yes, sir?
What about Hill's transcontinental railroad route?
I know, that was 1880s, 1890s, and that was in fact privately financed. But that's later, right? That's later. In fact, I nearly threw that in, but I didn't. But yeah, you're quite James J. Hill. But that's, yeah, I've read my... I've read my books as well. You're quite right, but that was the first one. That's the first, seriously, that is the first railroad that is actually profitable, right? Yes?
This is probably just due to me missing something, but so I believe at one point you said that like someone summarized the causes for the Industrial Revolution as being that coal was cheap and labor was expensive.
Yeah, that's Robert Allen.
But didn't you just say that wages stagnated? So why would labor be more expensive than they've been in the past?
That's not the point. The point is wages did stagnate, right, okay, in the 18th century. Actually, you've got to be careful. Wage rate, you've got to be so careful. Wage rate stagnated. Earnings rose because of the Industrious Revolution. But the key point is the wage rate, right? How much did it cost to employ a man? The point is they may have stagnated, but they were much the highest in Europe of any city, was London, right? Wage rates in, for how much you have to pay for an 10-hour day or a 12-hour day, which is what people worked, right? How much you pay for an hour, right? In London, in the building trades, right? We've got that sort of data, right? And for that matter, actually on farms as well, right? Which is much lower, right? So they were higher. They were higher in Britain than they were in Europe. So it's cheaper to use human beings to do manual labor relative to the price of coal. That's the point. Look, I really don't want to explain the Industrial Revolution just in those terms. But his point is that coal is cheap, so therefore, and you've got steam engines, so therefore energy, right, generated by steam engines is relatively cheap, right? You with me? And the work effort of workers whose wages may have stagnated, but they're still higher in London than they are anywhere else in Europe, right? Okay, means that the cost of energy produced by steam engines is relatively cheap to the energy produced by human beings. That's Allen's argument. But back to you. Go on.
But you just said that. But no. I mean that makes sense definitely. But you also said something that I found surprising as well. That you said that like water power was very important, and with that case, I suppose the increased availability of coal wouldn't be a factor.
Yeah. No. That just makes the okay. No, I read recently that apparently the early textile factories in the Industrial Revolution were largely water powered and not steam powered. Right. Okay. So maybe the argument has to be more sophisticated. It still means, look, if wage rates are high compared with elsewhere in Europe, right, water power is more attractive than human energy in where there is water power in England compared with elsewhere, right? So that argument still stands, right? And then later on when they transition, right, when they transition over to steam, that argument kicks in. All right? So I don't think the argument about the cost of energy generated by steam engines and the cost of labor, energy generated by people using the bare hands, actually it's more sophisticated, right? But it doesn't actually contradict it by the point that I made, I suggest, as I think about it. But I'll stick to what I said. I have to think fast here. Yeah.
Are you saying that like energy was getting cheaper and labor was staying the same?
It's all about relative prices. Seriously, it is all about relative prices. Yeah. Now you've got to think like an economist. It's relative prices, right? That's the point. It's relative prices. So therefore,
the rate would be the same. The rate would get bigger if the cost of labor got more expensive, or if the cheapness of energy got more cheap. Okay, that's a bad way of saying it.
Yeah, no. If energy gets cheaper, the relative price of labor to energy goes up. If wages rise, the relative price of labor to energy generated by labor to energy generated by machines goes up. Either way, it doesn't make any difference. It's a relative price. It's entirely the relative price.
So you can do like a cost per megawatt comparison between them?
Well, if you want to, although that's modern terminology. But yeah, it is.